Hey there, guys. Right here in front of me is the new Minisforum UN1245. Now, this is a very interesting mini PC because it really shows you how Intel killed the i3. Now, to understand what I mean by that statement, we need to understand how Intel's product stack actually exists. The i3 was essentially always the bridge between the low end, which consisted of the Celerons and the Pentiums, and brought you up into the minimum threshold to be considered a core product. So the biggest advantages that it always had was the fact that you got the same or very similar single core performance of the higher end chips, just on a lower end, usually lower core count CPU. And the i3 line has always seen popularity amongst budget builders because, especially in the early parts of the last decade, high core counts weren't exactly common or very necessary for the vast majority of popular titles at the time. So savvy buyers would always go with i3s or i5s instead of shelling out more money for i7s that a lot of the time only really gave you an advantage in terms of hyperthreading. But a lot of advancements have happened in terms of CPU and also software out there, to the point now where these lower core count parts are starting to show their age. And as competition between Intel and AMD has heated up, core counts have really skyrocketed, especially in the mobile department. But in one segment where things have really lagged behind, it has been on the low end of the desktop market. In today's Intel desktop product line, the lowest end is the i3 13100. Now, this is a 4-core 8-thread i3, and it is pretty much the lowest end core branded product you can actually get on the desktop. Of course, there are lower end Pentiums and Celerons, but this is as low as it gets to get into that core architecture. So out of curiosity, I actually went onto Micro Center's website and put together a system for the i3 13100. And what I was able to piece together was a system with a final price before tax of $385. So that was $130 for the CPU, $75 on the motherboard with a discount, around $40 for 16 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz RAM, $35 for a 1TB SSD, $45 for a very basic and generic mid-tower ATX case, and then $60 for the cheapest power supply that they had available that was actually 80 plus bronze. Now, this is of course branded Power Spec, which is an in-store brand for Micro Center. So in total, just a little bit under $400 for getting the entire system up and running. That is, of course, with a 4-core 8-thread CPU. Now let's compare it to the Minisforum here. Now I got this system for $250, but that was bare bones. So that means no RAM and no SSD. So I put in a 1TB SSD that I already had, and I had 16 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz SODIMM memory. So I was pretty much able to piece it together all in total cost to me up front for just $250. But obviously, if you're putting together a system like this yourself, you're more than likely also buying an SSD and you are buying the RAM. So you're looking at around $300 to $320 USD, just depending on the exact prices of the parts that you would get. Now, this specific system comes with the i5-12450H. That is an 8-core, 12-thread CPU, so that is 4 performance core, 4 efficiency cores. Now, this exact system comes with a stock TDP of 45 watts. Now, this i5-12450H also ends up coming with the Intel UHD graphics that is with 48 execution units, which is about double what you actually end up getting on the i3 13100. So in this tiny system right here, we get 8 cores, 12 threads. We got 16 gigabytes of RAM, a 1TB SSD, and even 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, and of course built-in Wi-Fi, all for a lower price than it would take to make a desktop PC with the i3 that has a significantly lower core count, significantly fewer threads, and you're using bare bones in terms of a case, in terms of a motherboard, which means you are not getting a lot of the extra features that this little system comes with. It's a really odd turn of events to see a system here that for a cheaper price is actually a significantly better overall system, and it's because it's using laptop parts. Intel really has put a lot more thought and effort into their laptop product stack than they have their desktops. And it really shows how, in the low end of the market, Intel is more than willing to completely ignore the i3 and just leave it to be such a bad alternative that no one should ever even consider it. Even the laptop equivalent i3, that being the i3-1315U, has moved away from the 4-core 8-thread nightmare and has transitioned instead to a 6-core design that pairs 2 performance cores with 4 efficiency cores with a total of 8 threads. And that even sees a bump in the included iGPU to a 64EU version of the Intel UHD graphics. But of course, this i3 is also a very rare sight on any systems out there that have more than 8 gigabytes of RAM. A lot of the times you're going to find it very nicely discounted, but only on systems that have a soldered on 8 gigabytes of RAM configuration, which will really hold back a system like this. And at the price point that this i5 is at, there's almost no reason to really go with an i3 either. Very rarely will you even find any mini PCs that have it, and the price difference really is just not going to be worthwhile enough to consider anything but this i5 here. Its biggest limitation is really just the fact that the iGPU that it has in it isn't exactly the greatest, but you aren't really going to be gaming on a system like this anyway. The biggest selling point is the fact that the CPU built in is a fantastic alternative to pretty much anything on the low end of the market and is relatively competitive with AMD's offerings within the same price range, also boasting a far superior single core performance. The i5 actually manages to boast a Cinebench R23 score of 8,919 with a single core score of 1,636 in comparison to what I could find of the i3 13100. That ended up giving a Cinebench multi-score of 7,321 and a CPU single core score of 1,512. So losing out on both multi and single core performance to this mobile i5 that you can find in this mini PC. So that should help paint a picture to you about just how much Intel has kind of given up on the desktop side of the i3 line, to the point where you can get yourself a mini PC like this that ends up being faster and cheaper, already discounted PC with the desktop equivalent i3. And this is an i5 right here. You can very much see that the mobile side of things gets the vast majority of the attention from Intel, and it makes sense. Laptops pretty much outsell desktops by such a significant margin that desktop is pretty much at this point an afterthought. Now, of course, there are still some benefits of going down the desktop route. For example, you could in theory drop a higher end CPU into this system, though we are already very much compromising on the motherboard that we have. So if you go down the route of just the absolute cheapest build possible from Micro Center, then you are limiting yourself to future upgradability anyway. But the truth of the matter also is on the desktop side that you don't need to spend that much more money to get a pretty meaningful upgrade in terms of usability. Going up to the i5-12400 at Micro Center, which is $150, you get a 6-core 12-threaded CPU, which is already going to be a pretty meaningful upgrade in comparison to the i3. But that's also kind of the point that I'm making here, that the i3 has essentially been phased out to the point where it is such an unviable option that an extra $20 gets you a pretty meaningful upgrade that will lead to an overall better computing experience. So let's hope soon that Intel actually makes the i3 equivalent on the desktop finally a viable option again. But as it stands right now, mini PCs are kind of just taking over, and it's mostly due to the fact that at these lower end prices, you can get some actually very nice configurations, and they're very much some viable options. I'll be doing a full review video on this Minisforum PC, so stay tuned for that. But I just really wanted to talk about how the i3 has kind of just ended up dying on us. And as someone who has always been a more budget conscious buyer, it's kind of sad to see as that era of making around $400 ultra budget gaming PCs has really just died out and really been pushed more towards the $500 to $600 price range. But stay tuned for more reviews of these mini PCs and also making some budget builds. We'll catch you guys in the next one.